There's an American saying, before you judge a man, walk 2 miles in his shoes. There's a more culturally dodgy version of that. Before you judge a man, walk 2 moons in his moccasins. All writers need to do this. It's particularly true for writers of biography. Although in the case of biography, you're more likely to walk 2 decades than 2 moons. You should beware of the friend who's a writer, especially if they write fiction. Don't tell them your juicy family gossip. God, don't tell them your relationship mistakes, because writers steal. We're eavesdroppers, we're thieves. And isn't that true of all literary imagining of other people's experience? Isn't it a kind of misappropriation? Well, all literary imagining of other people's experiences, except biography, of course. After all, biography is a factual account of a real life. The life, that life story exists independent of the person writing about it. The subjects of biographies aren't characters that you imagine like a novelist. Their experiences happened, but at the same time their characters and their stories are also the creation of the biographer's imagination. Of course, writing biography involves imagining someone else's experience. Many fiction writers fall in love with their characters. They feel them coming alive, and the same is true for biographers. Many biographers dream of their subject. They talk to them. They feel them sitting beside them in the car or at the dinner table or in the archive. There you are, the biographer, walking through a landscape where your subject once lived, and there's your subject, peeking over behind your shoulder, commenting on how it's changed. As a biographer, you become obsessed by your subject. You become obsessed by the person that you're researching and writing about. And then, after a short while, you are effectively possessed by them. Long after you're done, they hang around because you're never really done. And part of the reason you're never really done is because your story is only a version of their lives. You're never sure you've got it right or whether it's true. I wrote a biography of the Welsh Jewish author Lily Tobias. She lived for a long, near century, from 1887 to 1984. And though I finished that book in 1914, no, I'm not that old, in 2014, some 4 years on, she's with me still, with her George Eliot turns of phrase and her dashes. I never used to use dashes in punctuation, and now I can't stop. All through the events marking the centenary of the First World War, I felt her there with me, wondering how she might have responded. I know she would have worn a white poppy, for example. I'm certain of that. She risked arrest frequently during the First World War when she helped conscientious objectors. Her own brothers were conscientious objectors, and she was a pacifist. But she isn't some secret, invisible friend. She was a real person. And though she died long before I was aware of her, sometimes I feel I know her better than anyone else. And how's that for presumption? I don't know her better than anyone else. I don't know her at all. My version of Lily Tobias never lived. She's a product, though not entirely a figment, of my imagination. There's a wonderful story by Edgar Allan Poe in which the narrator becomes obsessed by a face that he glimpses in the crowd. How wild a history, he says to himself, is written within that bosom. And he follows the man and watches him. He's desperate to know more about him. He's desperate to know him. And I think this is a wonderful image of the biographer. The story, the man, the crowd has many interpretations, but I like to think of it as an image of the biographer, obsessively following somebody that you glimpse and you don't know, but that you think you can know, you think you do know if you just observe closely enough. And that you'll know things about them that nobody else does. At the end, though, of Poe's story, the narrator concludes that he can't understand this man that he's following. He's a type only, the type and genius of deep crime. And beyond that, his behaviour and character can't be understood, can't be read. I think it's a dangerous moment in biographical writing if you don't reach that conclusion. And I don't mean that all subjects of biography are the geniuses of deep crime, although clearly many of the political ones are. I mean that ultimately they can't be known. And if you feel confident that you can know your subject, you risk forgetting that it is only a story that you're telling, one of a number of possible stories. But how can that be so? Biography isn't fiction, after all. With biography, you're dealing with facts. And yes, that's true. There are facts. There's documentary evidence. There is verifiable information. And if your subject left correspondence, then you can know how they wrote. You can hear their voice. And just as useful, although also very challenging, is if the subject of your biography was an author, because then you have their texts as well. Of course, if you read into those texts something about the author, you too, as author, may be read into your own text. And so you should be. The biographer's not objective or impartial. We're not social scientists interpreting and presenting data. We're telling a story about facts, and the story is an invention. Andrea Wolf's prize-winning biographer, Andrea Wolf is a prize-winning biographer, Andrea Wolf's prize-winning biography of Humboldt begins at 17,000 feet in the Andes. It's cold and Humboldt's feet are bleeding. The soles of his shoes are too thin. It's a really dramatic and gripping opening. And it's chosen because it was there that Wolf, according to Wolf, that Humboldt first conceived of nature in the way that has had such a lasting impact on how we see the world. And accordingly, that's the title of her biography, The Invention of Nature. Throughout the biography, you can feel the author's immense respect and affection for her subject and her sense of him as a human who feels, who's voracious, who's curious, and who suffers and perseveres. But he's evoked as much by her imagination of him, for example, in that opening near the summit of a high mountain, as through his own words and deeds. And there's nothing controversial about that. It's what makes it such a compelling read, and it's what makes any biography a good read. If a biographer can't evoke the character of their subject and tell a coherent and engaging story, well, you might as well read a Wikipedia article or look at a list of dates. By coincidence, I began in a similar vein. I started my biography of Tobias at the midpoint of her life, with her husband's murder, which was a trauma when she was 51. I could have chosen another path through her life, but that tragedy shaped her next near half-century, and the evidence for it is there in her writing and in her work and in her letters. It was tragic in part because everything that led up to it was undone by that murder. And it was tragic too because of what we could know about it after the fact that she couldn't have known at the time. I saw in her life story the contours of a tragedy that she certainly would never have seen, and I took those facts and I made them into a story about her. So is this telling a story about someone else's life a kind of theft? Like all creative writing that deals in others' experiences rather than your own? And can you justify it? Can you justify that act of imagination that is a kind of appropriation? Well, I think you can. And it takes us back to this saying about walking 2 moons in another man's moccasins. In 1995, the children's book, Walk 2 Moons, won the prestigious Newbery Medal. And it's a story about coming to terms with bereavement. It's a lovely children's book and it's well worth reading. It includes elements of Native American identity. And inevitably, the author, Sharon Creech, was immediately criticised for straying into such dangerous territory. As a reviewer in the New York Times remarked, a set of responses to the book asked, how dare a white outsider write about sacred Indian experience? Increasingly, we patrol the borders of experience, aware of the dangers of cultural appropriation, of the presumptuousness of using other people's experience for our own purposes. And yet surely we must engage in that imaginative leap if we're to write about anything that isn't simply narrowly self-referential. 2 moons or 2 miles is not enough. The task for the writer is to walk a lot further and for much longer in someone else's shoes. and to remain afraid, no matter how far we walk or for how long, of still getting it wrong. That fear should drive us to try and get it right, to do rigorous rather than superficial research, to remain alert to our own assumptions and prejudices, to assess our own position and social power relative to the subject's position and social power, or the group that we seek to write about that we're not part of. Being afraid of getting it wrong might help us get it right. It might give us a sensitivity to the problems. For example, so that we don't inadvertently perpetuate stereotypes, like the stereotypes in this familiar Native American saying, so-called saying, walk 2 moons in his moccasins. How is that a Native American saying? What does that even mean? Because which tribe, what period, what's the context? And you could say, oh, surely it doesn't matter. I mean, all Native Americans wear moccasins, don't they? They all talk about moons instead of months. They're all deeply in touch with nature. And we know that they impart great wisdom, universal wisdom, in pithy sayings. These are stereotypes, of course, albeit purportedly admiring ones. But like all stereotypes, positive or negative, they reduce and generalize and caricature. People become representations instead of individuals. Cultural or ethnic groups become collections of essentialist tropes. Some writers complain about policing, demanding that the freedom of the writer's imagination should be treated as sacrosanct. But for which group is this alleged policing really a constraint? Those who are free to write about whatever they choose and to be held account for getting other people's experience wrong? Or those seeking to escape the ethnic pigeonhole that readers and critics and the book industry has put them in, so that all they're permitted to write about is their own minority cultural experience? I'm going to walk right back out of that contested territory that Sharon Creech walked into and come back to biography. And it's all about shoes, because I've got a bit of a thing about shoes. It's not moccasins this time, or Humboldt's thin-soled shoes, but Lily Tobias's practical flats, or maybe her strappy heels, I don't know. I tried to walk in them for some 15 years, and yet when I wandered around the post-industrial town of Ystalyfera, where she grew up, I felt like the narrator in Poe's story when he concludes, "It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him, nor of his deeds." How could I understand the experience of somebody so different from me? I feel I do, but I might well have got her story very wrong. And I'd like to give you an example of my doubts, one that involves more footwear, I'm afraid. In this case, it's boots. In Tobias's second novel, My Mother's House, the protagonist, Simon, is a working-class Welsh Jewish boy who's mocked by his social climbing cousin in Swansea. "Fancy coming to town in hobnail boots," she exclaims about him. His hobnail boots denote his working-class Welshness in his cousin's eyes. She is trying to rid herself of her own Welshness, to anglicise her accent, and to rid herself of her other troubling difference too, her Jewishness. Simon's rough boots risk tainting her by association. It's a vivid illustration of judging somebody without walking in their shoes. I saw Tobias depicting in this fictional character all the pressure of anglicisation that she herself resisted. The evidence for that lies in her writing and also in her brother's oral testimony, which we have, but some of it also lies in her accent. Many people who knew her were very quick to note that even to the end of her life, much of which was lived outside Wales and much of it was where they encountered her, she spoke with a strong Welsh accent. Perhaps she did repudiate the Anglocentrism and social climbing that she depicts so acutely in that fictional character. But what if I'm wrong? What if she tried at every turn to anglicise her accent, and that yet those who met her refused to let her be anything but differently Welsh? I might have tried to walk in Tobias's shoes, but the resulting biography is an invention. It's based on evidence, as biography has to be, but it also entailed a leap of imagination. And I think this ambiguous border between imagination and fact, this discipline of biography, has something to offer how we approach difference more generally. Sure, you can stomp 2 miles in somebody else's boots, but also do your research. Respect the truth of other people's experience and try to recognise your own prejudices and projections. Be alert to your own position and power relative to your subjects. But above all, don't risk your assumptions for truth, nor mistake your imaginative empathy for real understanding. What happens if, like Simon's cousin, we don't try to walk in one another's shoes? Isn't that what's happening in our public space? We're losing the capacity even to listen. We don't want to see the world through other people's eyes. We want others to see the world through ours. We still mostly get out of the way of ambulances because we still mostly have a capacity to empathise with other people's emergencies, if only because we rely on them to empathise with our emergencies. But when that goes, what else do we have? What do we have left? For society to function, it requires mutual empathy, and a breakdown in that will make it impossible for society to function. So while I think we must patrol the borders of writing about other people's experiences so as not to co-opt or misrepresent it, the fear of getting it wrong should not keep us from trying to get it right. Maybe we'll get blisters in the process, and maybe in understanding others we might better understand ourselves. Maybe we'll also learn to listen more and to judge less. And maybe, just maybe, better still, we can learn not to judge at all. Thank you.